So let's talk about the ways that it's personal. Crisis impacts every part of our lives. It's physical. It impacts our sleep, our adrenaline, our cortisol. It's emotional. It triggers anger, grief, guilt. It can trigger really deeply psychological feelings of anxiety or panic. It can bring up past traumas. Spiritually, which is something people often overlook, there are elements of something called moral stress, which can be moral conflicts that people experience, or shaking of the kind of moral system in which someone lives. And finally, in most cases, it's deeply burdensome economically, whether that's simply paying for the lawyers themselves or as a part of the process of litigation. So let's look a little more closely at one piece of this. We say this is your brain on crisis. How do we know that this is true? One of the important and often completely overlooked factors is how much it impacts people's, how much crisis and trauma impact people's physical well-being. This is not just that it feels chaotic, but that our brains actually respond differently to extreme forms of stress, trauma, and grief. I'm not talking about when you wake up and you feel a little bit stressed out, you've had too much coffee. This is actually a full-on rewiring, chemical and biological reaction to crisis. Short term, what you can see from the effects of something called cortisol flooding, cortisol is our stress hormone, is that it leads to decreased self-regulation. That's another word for self-control. It can also trigger anxiety and panic, which lead to a greater feeling of being out of control. So in those situations, it's very difficult for the brain to activate critical thought. That's the front part of our brain that does executive function. When cortisol is flooding, it's all the kind of back of the brain instinctual response that we see. Over the long term, trauma can have actually permanent effects on the brain. So in the case of the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain, it's been shown to shrink as a result of crisis, which has long-term effects on cognition, so just mental processing, as well as memory. So you see this in all different forms of people experiencing types of crisis and trauma. It's also seen in my hospice work, we see it a lot for people experiencing grief. And sometimes grief experts call that grief brain or grief fog. So that's the setup for the brain in crisis and the brain experiencing trauma.